Right, it's 8 o'clock here in Melbourne, so we're going to kick things off. Hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along to our webinar series. This is the third in four that we're doing across the year. And really it's just a conversation between Victoria and I, opportunity for us to share some of our practices, but more importantly, to get your questions. So, as you hear us talk, things will spring to mind, and we really encourage you to ask us questions. The way we're going to do that and just manage all this is that we have you'll see on your window a Q&A panel. And that's where we want you to put your questions. You might think of putting your questions in the chat window, right? That's not the place for the questions. We won't be able to see them well enough there. We want them to be put into the Q&A window, your questions, and then everyone gets to upvote the questions they like. And what we'll do is we'll just take the questions from the top. So hopefully everyone gets that. And we'd love, just general observations in the chat window, anything else you want to say there, but any of your questions over in the Q&A. So just to set the scene, so Victoria and I have been chatting about a few different things. Usually in the first two episodes, if you like, Victoria, we were really looking at big culture change programs and how to use story in those large sort of culture change programs. And now we're kind of moving towards some more specific techniques, I guess, around, first of all, today we're going to be looking at strategy stories and just some of the things that you get beyond just communication. And then in our last of the series of four, Victoria is going to really drive a description and an exploration around a technique that she's been using for what, about 15 years or so? Yeah. And in that, and the technique is a sort of an interviewing technique using story sort of methods. So that's what we're doing. So thanks everyone for coming along. It's great to have you here. I guess just to kick things off around this strategy story idea, we've been doing strategy stories for, I don't know, probably a good 10 years now. And our first one was actually for the Transport Accident Commission, TAC here in Victoria. They're the guys who are like a public insurer. So if any accident happens on the road here in Victoria, the state of Victoria, you're covered by TAC. And, they had a situation where they had a new CEO. CEO wanted to get everyone on the same page in terms of her strategy. And she discovered that, she already had a strategy. It was sort of from the previous CEO. She was really trying to... that's... Stop it. Yeah, so Siri talking to me, I can't even think. Anyway, with the CEO, she was trying to get everyone on board and on the same page. And so we took their executive team and actually a much broader leadership group through a process of crafting their strategy story. And it had a tremendous impact on that organisation because they first... it was the first time I think they really understood their strategy. Actually, that was the thing that really jumped out for me. But the thing that I went back and chatted to them about a year after we did that project, and Janet Dorr, the CEO, she was saying to me that the thing that really had the big difference, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Victoria, was it was the first time that she had sort of everyone on the same page because they'd gone through this process, that sense-making process of crafting a story. I'm sure you must have seen that sort of thing happen in some of your work. What do you think? Yeah. What are some of the things that have jumped out for you in that space?
Well, actually, two things came to mind as you were talking. Thank you for asking. The first was, and I may have mentioned this in another of our episodes. I love you calling them episodes, by the way. That's marvellous. It makes us sound like a series, doesn't it? Yeah, really podcasty. So was when we were doing, creating a communication around a knowledge management strategy and using a rich picture. it was negotiating clarity, taking the words off the page and out of being abstract words and using, in fact, in that case, a metaphor, negotiating an agreed metaphor for what this strategy was about, to force clarity and a kind of fruitful misunderstanding. A friend of mine calls it fruitful misunderstanding. By misunderstanding each other live, you then get to a shared understanding, and it's not just on the page, it's in you as well. So you've also got the memory of having done that together.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important.
It is important. I see that dynamic a lot in that process of crafting the strategy, because the strategy story, because someone will start telling the story, and as they're telling it, another person across the table sort of goes, oh, so that's what you meant about, X. And you can sort of see the pennies dropping, and everyone's sort of going, and then they're forced to tell their version of the story. And next thing you know, they're getting closer and closer and get on that same page. I think that's one of the really interesting dynamics that happen when you're creating these strategy stories.
It is, and it's the iteration as well. I mean, one of the things I find with organizations, they're very intolerant of rehearsal. They drive to performance. And actually what you're doing by doing it your way, I hear, is that you are creating a kind of rehearsal space to allow them to rehearse together and then find whatever the performance version of the strategy story is.
Yes. Now, the strategy story structure that we use is dead simple, right?
Yeah.
We just use what I call a clarity story. If you have a look in my book, there's the whole section on clarity stories. But the structure is simply this. So in the past, it was like this, and then something happened. So that's why we're doing this. And that's where you put your strategic decisions in there, or choices. So in the future, we can be like that. That's a very simple structure. I've got an example here. I didn't think about showing this, but you might get an idea. This is actually for a, well, maybe I should cover their logo, but look, this is an example. So in the past, they were like this, then something happened. I probably should have practiced this before I thought about it. These sort of
this is your rehearsal space.
So in the future, so now this is what they're doing in the future. It's going to be like that. And you might think to yourself, God, there's hardly any words on that. How's that going to be a strategy? But the key thing is that's designed to help them tell the strategy in their own words, right? And I think this is a key element, because people are influenced by leaders who can put things in their own words, they don't feel like they're scripted, and they can actually start to share their own anecdotes and bring it to life in a way that kind of makes sense. So that's just a little snapshot of this idea of a strategy story. It's a simple idea which has a phenomenal impact in organizations.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about that before we go to the other people's questions? So this is very good, this clarity story stuff. And I really like, by the way you've really worked out this relation between the small stories and the big strategy story. What are the moments that illuminate different parts? So I have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay, from a recent exercise using this. So this is a strategy story where the "and then something happened" part also involves quite a dip in morale in the organization when a strategic mistake was made. Yeah. And some of the people who need to buy into this is where we're going and this is what it'll look like when we get there, are still quite stuck in the emotional bruising of, and then something happened and it was pretty terrible for some people, but we came through it bit. So when you're doing this, if you've got people with long memories or shorter memories or whatever, what do you do when people get stuck in a part of the past and they can't get on to the future because they're still dealing with whatever this trauma was?
Around an axle on a particular story. So it happens quite often. And one of the things I've learned is that you can't dislodge a story with clever opinion and argument and facts. You can only dislodge a story with a better story, right? And part of it is in your strategy stories, working out where do you want to start your story. See, say if you've got this event that happened 10 years before, it might be actually useful just to start your story 5 years in the past, right? And so your in your past doesn't have to talk about your whole history. It could be something recent. And if that thing is a really tough story that's going to come up, we call them anti-stories. And you have to deal with anti-stories separately. And the best way to deal with an anti-story is, first of all, you've got to name it. So you say things like, look, I know you might be thinking that, and then you tell them about you tell them the story they already have in their head. And just by doing that, it's amazing. It's like a lot of energy just goes out of the story, right? It's almost like they go, oh, you know. Yeah. And so that's how you deal with it. But I think there's another element in there too, which is important. That is, it's very easy to come up with an overly negative story, right? It's almost like the past was terrible, these terrible things have happened to us, so we've got to change. Unfortunately, if you do that, you just kill the morale of the people you tell the story to, right? Because they were there through the whole lot. So you've got to tell a story that gives them, it recognises the good work that they've done and the great things that they've contributed, but also doesn't sugarcoat the problems, because if you do that, you don't have an authentic story. And no one believes a story that sort of says, we were great, we were fantastic, we were awesome. You've got to have stories with the ups and downs. Yeah.
I think there's something very interesting in that, which is reminding me of one of the things when you'll talk coaching is to think about when you do mood matching with the person you're coaching.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, there's a thing to do. What you said is, in my experience, also true. You need to witness the complex emotions people are holding, who might be very loyal to the organization, have felt disrespected or sidelined, or don't even know whether they want to be part of a future that's unclear to them or might involve a lot of change for them.
Yes.
But there's something about acknowledging, as you say, witnessing their good work, acknowledging it. And once people are heard, they can hear. There's a phenomenal thing, but to do that, not in a razzmatazz kind of jazz hands, it's all going to be spun and great and, not airbrushing out the difficult parts without getting stuck in them. And leaders, in my experience, when they're telling the strategy story, find it very hard not to get a bit airbrushy and jazz handy and kind of railroad the emotions, because they're actually frightened of engaging with them. So there's something about coaching leaders to stay open without feeling vulnerable that I have experienced in doing this kind of work. I don't know if you have that.
I have, and actually connects to the top question that we have by Paul Cooper, which is in my mind anyway, in terms of this idea of the S word. I talk about avoiding the S word in story work, the S word being story, the word story, because it has all these negative connotations. And I find this with leaders, as soon as you say things like, oh, tell me the story, they get all freaked out by that, right? They think they have to create some Hemingway level, beautiful, sort of story of some sort. So in answering Paul's question, what I typically do is just use language which still gets me a story, but doesn't use the S word. So I'll say things like, oh, that's very interesting. Can you just maybe describe how that unfolded for you? And the leader goes, oh, the way it unfolded was, we were like this, and, they start to tell the story, right? Or you sort of say, that's really interesting. So what happened? What happened then? And they tell you the next level of the story. And in those stories, that's when these complex emotions start to reveal themselves, right? And if you keep it at the level of opinion and viewpoint and added, sort of at that sort of conceptual level, where people are using those words that end in ION, we're going to do the, essentially all the language that you hear in organisations around, reductions, accelerations, whatever those things that they talk about. I try to get them away from all that and just get them staying in that story.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's, I find that I have had a slightly different experience, because I've found in some of the clients I've been working in recently that using the term story or storytelling gives me permission to be creatively a little bit disruptive with them.
Right, interesting.
Whereas if I just, so potentially, because that's how I've been framed coming in, there's this, and you have to be careful, because actually that can also create resistance. But I think that listening and that allowing it to unfold, there's something that I often think is quite interesting, is the first thing people tell you isn't where the story is, because it's still got this layer of being readily accessible or whatever. It's going back round, or it's finding something a little bit under that, which is a bit surprising to them. They didn't expect and there, I'll come to this next time in terms of some techniques around that, but you're making me also think that people often forget some key parts of the strategy story package, in my experience. And so one of the things that leaders very often forget to do is to think about their own stories as authorized tellers of this strategy story. What gives me credibility? And that's getting them to, they just want to go straight into the strategy story, but actually they need to arrive as someone who's worth listening to. So very often when I'm doing this work is kind of getting them to think, well, what's my experience of a change like this? So I know you might be thinking that this change looks very ambitious, but let me just tell you a little bit about when I have done this somewhere else or in another division, because then that also, that story of them creates some credibility for why should I commit to this person as well as to this story. So I think very often the leadership team forget what their brand story is or what their individual stories are as credible talents.
I agree, and and it makes an enormous difference once they can pinpoint some of those stories, right? But let me segue into, if you like, that's the setup for this strategy story conversation. But I wanted to, one of the things I found really interesting is that you can really focus on how strategy stories are great for, sort of communicating strategy. That's kind of like the obvious thing. But I was thinking about this recently, and I've written a little paper, and I'll share that with everyone, that there are all these additional benefits that you get from a strategy story, which somehow surprised me in the first instance. So the first one I wanted to chat about was the fact that I'm actually quite surprised at how many organisations say they have a strategy, but don't actually have a strategy, right? So an example that springs to mind for me is that I had a call from a company from the other side of the world in Europe, called us up in Melbourne. It was the guy head of strategy for, I don't know, 10 people or so, 20 people in this group actually. And they wanted a strategy story. But as soon as I started to ask them, oh, okay, sort of, well, if you can send your strategy to me, it was clear that they'd sort of go, oh, well, I don't have that in really one spot. And, they were ducking and weaving. And it turned out they didn't have a strategy. What they had was a series of planners who did this sort of project portfolio management. And they had 250 projects. So this group managed these projects. But they didn't have an overarching strategy. And so that's when I realised we had to go in and use the strategy story framework to help them work out what their strategy was. It was almost like a reverse engineering of all the things they do. And I always say that there always is a strategy in an organisation, whether it's explicit or not, because they're doing stuff and they're doing stuff in a certain way, and it might be an emergent sort of strategy. But the story process of just getting an executive group around the table and getting them to go through that process of crafting that story is where they sort of go, oh, okay, this is essentially the strategy that we're doing, right? This is it. Then you can go back the next level and sort of get them to verify whether that's actually a good strategy or not. So at least it gets them into the starting blocks, I think, in terms of their strategy. But it's kind of a backwards approach in some ways. We kind of always assumed that people had their strategy and we were there to help them communicate it. I don't know, have you ever had that sort of situation?
I have had that. And in fact, I had that question recently, a couple of those questions recently. So I might try them out on you when I was running a storytelling session recently.
Yeah.
Two questions, which I have had this a lot. And there's something quite alarming for people about how blank the canvas is around the strategy and how muddled with words. It's crowded with words, but it doesn't actually mean anything. There's plenty of documentation of the thing that might otherwise have been a strategy, but nothing that cuts through. So I think what the work that you do is to cut through. But one of the questions I have is one to do with control and emergence, actually. In the absence of a strategy, people will have some sense of the values of the organization and the principles and a general vague, fuzzy sense of direction and whatever it says in the brochures and on the website. So they're seeking some guidance, some North Star or whatever. But then what will happen is that people at lower levels, in divisions or product divisions or whatever, will go, well, we've got to have some kind of strategy. So they'll make their own lower level strategies. So you'll find people making lower level strategies and then resenting the creation of the strategy at the higher level. So I don't know if you have, because they've kind of got it sorted for themselves and then suddenly they're having to agree something which has more collective understanding. I mean, that gap management or that kind of negotiation between those different levels from the smaller to the larger, I don't know what experience you've got of that.
We've done it where we've started from the very bottom and actually collected stories and worked out from the stories what's the strategy actually in action, right? What's the strategy actually happening based on the actions of the organization? And what you end up doing in that situation is you get phenomenal buy-in, but it's really hard to scale. I remember when I worked at IBM, we did a process like that for the whole organization. I think it was 300,000 people, but it was all technology enabled, right? And they didn't really have a story base. It was very much opinion based. So it got a little, I find when you have opinions, people argue over opinions, whereas they don't argue over stories. Like if someone says, oh, this is the story that happened. Rarely people go, that's not right. That's not what happened. Or if they do, they'll sort of say, oh, that's not how I remember it. It's a much softer way of interacting rather than, you're wrong, I'm right type approach. I'm just
Can I ask another question? Can I just ask another question about that?
Go. Yeah.
The other question that came up at this thing, which I had an answer for, but I'd be really interested in yours before we get back to other people, is what happens if I'm a leader and I can see this strategy work happening, strategy work happening, but actually I don't really buy into it. So when I'm telling the strategy story, I'm kind of holding it slightly sniffily at arm's length while pretending not to, but everybody can tell, right? Because if you hold a story out here, everybody knows you're not holding it in here. They can tell. I mean, because it's just not coming from, because you're in storytelling, you're actually meeting at the gut level, right? You're not meeting at the head level, you're meeting at the heart and in the belly, really. And that's how you know it's kind of chiming. So what kind of, what thoughts do you have around, I bet you've come across that, right?
And it's a serious management issue, that one, in terms of if you have, well, I'll tell you how an organization dealt with it, right? So it was an insurance company. They had, they developed the strategy story. They got quite a few people involved in developing the strategy story. And if you like, it was almost through the telling and the retelling that more and more people got connected into the story. And even those people who had it at arm's length, they could see through social proof that other people were, connected to the story. And the story had the evidence in it, and they were involved in it. But more importantly, they're seeing their other colleagues. And then they went the last step, which was the CEO said, whenever any proposal for funding or new ways of operating, before you're allowed to even put on your PowerPoint deck, you had to tell him the strategy story and how it relates to your part of the business. And so people were then starting to go, oh, okay, so how do I make this work? And so it was a little very clever sense-making device, if you like, for that organisation.
It's not just sense-making, is it? That social proof, the story about the story, but also the symbolic gestures of the leaders constantly reincorporating the story into, almost richly reincorporating the story into different settings. So people have to express it, and bit by bit they have to get closer to it and they have to internalize it. That's very nice. I like that. Shall we have a little look at our questions?
I'm just going to touch on some of the questions. So we got here from Karen. She was just asking what are some of the best tips for using someone else's story effectively. You know, how do you make it your own? And here's this one. Making your own is an interesting one, Karen. I would say that for me, it's fine to use other people's stories, especially if they've told you that, and it seems like it's in the public sphere, and you know, people can hear that story in other places. But for me, it's important to sort of say things like, you know, oh, I was chatting to Victoria the other day, and she told me this really interesting thing, you know, and I tell the story that Victoria told me. Now, I'm making it clear it's Victoria's story, right? I'm not saying, oh, I had this interesting experience the other day, and then I tell Victoria's story as if it happened to me, right? If you do that, you're getting yourself into big strife. And we've seen it. My business partner, Mark, I believe Mark's on the session tonight, we went to a presentation, and the speaker, or the MC for the day, said he was at the airport just this morning, and he saw this woman in the corner, and she was crying, and he went over to her, and he started telling this story, and we both looked at each other and went, we know this story, right? And on the phones, we have a quick look on the internet, and there it was. It was a story that was, you know, told by that lady, you know, 10 years before. It was one of those almost, you know, meme-like stories. But he was telling it as if it happened to him, right? And as soon as that you do that, you're really setting yourself up for all sorts of problems, I think. I don't know, what's your experience of it?
I think you are, and I think your guidance is very good. There's a little unease in me. There's a paper actually that Sailor shared with me about not capturing other people's stories. You know, don't steal our stories, I think it's called. I can share it with people if you like. It's a bit more like a research thing.
Yeah.
But there is something about being extremely, depending on what the story is. If it's fun and it's an aha moment and it's obviously something I've chosen to share, fine.
Yeah.
But if it's a story that the sharing of it in some way affects me, or you might take it and bend it in a direction, you need to be, there's a kind of custodianship or stewardship of the stories of others, and just checking that you've represented it or changed names. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and she was telling me a story about, so there's a light anonymization.
Yes.
If you want to tell a story that might otherwise be exposing to the person, which I think is quite important as well. So that would be my kind of thing.
Yeah, I like that. So anyway,
the best channel to communicate the story to employees. Right, what is the best channel to communicate story? I'm going to go first on this, Shawn, only because I think people get hung up on what's written down. And actually, the social proof thing you were saying earlier is the best channel to know the story is traveling in, which is a bit different than you choosing to communicate it. The best traveling to look after is when it's moving by word of mouth between people, and you're picking that up, even if the word of mouth is a bit on Yammer or something like that. So your goal is actually for you not to be pushing, but for you to be noticing that it's traveling by word of mouth. So one thing is the leaders turning up in different places and happening to engage people with the story, or starting different campfires around the story in many different settings. I think the Chimamanda Adichie has a great TED talk actually called The Dangers of the Mono Story, or something like that. Just one story in one setting at the town hall or the annual conference is a broadcast. So I think having a very multi-layered strategy about where it's going to show up, in what language, in what collateral, different language for different peoples, a few visuals, people telling it, different, and break it down to bite-sized and be able to recombine those bite-sized pieces. So it's quite a campaign to create the environment in which it will travel. A really good example of that, which I don't know if this was in your book or not. Do you remember the Old Spice adverts?
Yeah, I do. I know what you're talking about.
So
I didn't write about it. No.
But somebody else in a storytelling book must have written about it then. You've also got to decide actually where the story is. Because in the case of the Old Spice campaign, for example, they are absurd adverts. And they did an absurd advert of a bloke on a horse, half naked and all the rest of it. And then they invited people who were users of Old Spice to submit ideas for adverts. And then their promise was that they would use these, turn them around very fast. Each 24 hours or something, a new one would turn up. So the story was actually in them listening to people and people having a huge amount of fun and the speed at which they turned that round. So the other thing when you're thinking about stories is actually, where is the storytelling moment happening? And how can you make it a kind of a participant, and how much are you showing as opposed to telling?
Yeah.
So the other thing is, well, how can you screen out the amount that you're talking and just do some doing that then is a gesture that travels and people pick up because they noticed it?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
I agree with what you're saying there. And when people I do get that question quite a bit, you know, what is the channel? It's that language of internal communications, you know, what's the channel? And I always say to them, your best channel are your leaders, you know, and it's the oral channel.
Yeah.
Your managers. And then the next question, of course, is, well, so how do you get that to scale, right? You know, how do we get a message out to 300,000 people? Well, I think you still keep it in an oral format, but you start to use video, you start to use podcasting, but you keep it in that oral conversational style. And I think that has all those things that those lovely sort of elements you were talking about, you know, get contained in that. Of course, what you really want to happen, and that's when you're sort of controlling things a little bit, what you really want to happen is that ecosystem of stories that are you know, sort of reinforcing the important things that you want to happen in your organization. It kind of relates to this point that Karen asked around triggering stories, right? We talk about storytelling, but, you know, we also know story listening and story triggering are, you know, like a triumvirate that you really want to think about. And the triggering I think is really important. You want people to do symbolic gestures, your leaders to do things which are so remarkable that people actually remark on them, right? And they tell a story about that. I think the best leaders are the ones who can do that. And it can be the smallest things, you know, like I remember when I was in IBM, we did a lot of work for the military, and the US military was trying to get people to use the collaboration environments, a bit like what we're doing now, but I think it was mainly with text. And so the Admiral just said, okay, well, I'm no longer having my group telephone call. We're going to do a group web chat. And just for him to do that, just sent stories flying through that organization, because it was against how people saw admirals, right? They saw them as this non-technical command and control sort of guy. Next thing you know, he's taking on questions from any person across the, you know, the command group and all that sort of stuff. And to me, that's a small thing that triggers stories that go around, and it sort of says what's important, and giving people permission to do other things similar to that. And so, yeah, Karen, I do it. Now, the line between whether something's manipulative versus something is an intentional process of influence, you know, that's what you want your leaders to do. You want them to influence and persuade, but you've got to do it with the right intent. And if your intent is for the good of the organization rather than your promotion, you know, well, then I would say that is more on, you know, good influence rather than manipulation. I think that's one of the things. But the real test of manipulation is if after you do it, right, say the leader does this remarkable thing, and then afterwards they say to the audience, okay, I just want to pull the veil from a way of, you know, pull the veil down so you can see what's happening here. What I did is I actually did this thing to generate these stories. And if people go, oh, that's a great idea. I could see why you did that. You now know it's not manipulative. If they turn around and go, you bastard, you bloody bastard, you know, you've done, then you know it's manipulative, right? It's almost like going through that little process in your head to sort of test whether, is this manipulative or not? Right?
I think it's not in your head, though. I think a lot of it you can tell from your gut. If you think, I think it's not a head reaction. I think it's a gut reaction.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually staying true to your instincts around this is quite possible, because actually the same thing, the same story might, it's very hard to keep a clean intent, particularly as organizations want to instrumentalize things so quickly. They want to turn things into product for people to consume. And they find it very uncomfortable to stay in a co-creation space where there's uncertainty and the unknown. And this actually comes a bit to Robert's question about my manager doesn't want stories. They just want data and facts. And I'm not quite going to answer that, Robert. I'll come to it, but you're making me think of an organization we worked with where the shift was in a part of strategy. So it was at the metaphorical level, it was the shift from compliance, the compliance division, the integrity division, policing the business areas to partnering with the business areas. So that's quite complicated because there are lots of things going on about lots of relationships there that need to shift in that story shifting. It's quite a complex cultural shift. But one of the things they did during this program as a sort of subset of that was get leaders to tell what they called integrity stories at their big gatherings and events, business events around the world. And I coached some of the leaders on those integrity stories. Now, what's interesting is in the coaching process, they would turn up with, this is what I think the story is I'd like to tell. And then we'd have a conversation about what the story was. And then I'd coach them and then get them to think how their stories sequenced with each other to build a bigger picture. So if you had 4 people sitting on a panel, not just what is each story individually, but how do they add up to a bigger picture of what do things look like in this new culture and what's my own experience of this when things didn't always go right. So it's sort of signaling quite a lot that we're collaborating to tell small stories that tell a bigger story. So there was that, and thinking about how my story ends and I pick up the next person's, so that you're creating this bigger conversation space. But what was also interesting, and I think this happens a lot with leaders, the storytelling culture, the old storytelling culture can get in the way of a new kind of storytelling. So in this case, for example, the kinds of stories they were telling me might be, oh, a manager discovers something's dodgy. The manager and the boss fly out to that person and say, don't you do that to us, you supplier. You're trying to take advantage of us. We won't do business with you anymore. And then come back and talk about this at a conference. Now, when they're first telling me that kind of story, they think the heroism is in the going and flying somewhere and saying, we won't take your business anymore, you supplier, even though you're one of us, our biggest suppliers. It's that heroic gesture. I said, I don't think that's where your story is. Your story is that the manager and the junior came with you and did that, but told the story at a conference, and people were saying to them, but didn't you think your bonus would be affected? And they said, no, our managers have got our backs, our leaders have got our backs. So I said, they're trying to tell the story of the heroic encounter, and actually the story of what's really changing in this culture is actually a smaller and later part of the story, and you need to shift the emphasis. So you also need to look at shifting the nature of the kinds of stories that leaders think are communicating the culture and move away from maybe some old habits there, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, does that am I making sense to you?
Yeah, I'm sort of trying to make a connection there in terms of, that, I guess it's that, again, going back to the pattern of how the small stories fit in with the larger stories and that back and forth that happens. I think the question Robert's asking, which I know you didn't you said you weren't going to directly answer, but the question I hear it as is, you have a whole bunch of people who are skeptical about the idea of story, and it makes me chuckle a little bit when I hear managers say things like, "Oh, well, we don't have time for stories," or "I don't want to hear stories." And I love it because, most managers wouldn't even know a story if it was told to them, right? And so for example, say if you've got a real numbers-driven manager who has been told stories are bad, right? Well, I tell those people data stories, right? And a data story would be simply something like, you pull out a graph, it might be a time series, and you sort of say, so you can sort of see 6 weeks ago, our stock was just trundling along, fairly evenly. And then we had the announcement. It was the Twitter tweet that Donald Trump made. And all of a sudden, our stock dropped 30 points. But, it didn't last long. We rallied really quickly. And because of the announcement our CEO made, you can sort of see now it's upticking about 30%. I guess what we've got to, and then you've just told them a story, right? And they'll be sitting there, if they're a real numbers person, they'll be sitting there totally lapping that up, and they won't be thinking it's a story. They'll be just thinking you're telling them facts, right? But you're doing it in a narrative structure. And I think this is the key point. I wrote a little paper. If you search our website, you will find a paper on data storytelling. And I sort of go through a few different techniques, you have available to sort of, tell a story that's very data laden, if you like. So stories don't always have to be big, emotional, sort of dramatic stories. They can be the smallest things and still have, sort of tremendous impact. But short is better.
Yeah. Short is better. Also, Robert, I wonder whether this is one of those situations where you're thinking about how you use your props. I think what you've said is, here's the PowerPoint deck. There's loads of data on it. Some of it's in pie charts and all the rest of it. So you give people the quantity of data they feel will reassure them, but you as the voiceover, the storyteller, going, look, all this stuff, the bigger picture, all this stuff. Let me wheel you through that. Let me just pick out one part of this chart to tell you something about someone was telling me about in the corridor. So you've created the reassurance that you've given them the knowledge product they need, and you've chosen which bits of it you're highlighting as the voiceover person. Yeah. So I think there's also that kind of thing to create the reassurance. Again, it's people's needs being attended to, like witnessing their stories earlier in the strategy story, Shawn. It's attending to the need. There's an anxiety there. Without the data, I can't do my job. So there's also something about then noticing that a story, as you say, can be really short. So you frame it by giving them sort of what they need very quickly, and then just teasing out a couple of highlights where your storyteller can illuminate the data. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, we got out of sync there. I don't know if anyone else noticed that, but really? Did we?
Obviously, it's okay. The video is caught up again now.
So explain framing. Okay.
Framing.
Okay.
I like it. You mentioned framing.
I mentioned framing. Listen, for me, the framing. Framing allows people to enter into the story with you. Like a frame around a picture allows you to see the picture differently. And you need to decide whether you're going to declare that frame to people or not. But one of the things you need to do, for example, in terms of people hearing you, is you might want to tell stories informally. Actually, Robert, that was you too. When and where you tell the stories, as opposed to show the data. So you might be telling some informal stories before you start the slide deck, which actually are the storytelling you want to tell. And then you do the information stuff. But you're framing the space with people. So you might come in and say, look, what the bigger picture of what we're going to talk about today is this. Before we get to that, can I just have your attention for a couple of minutes because I wanted to update you on something? Or I'm just going to step aside here from zooming through this and zoom in to a little point of view. So you're giving people the signposts to where you are in the picture, or you're framing what you're doing a little bit so that you can bring them with you as listeners. I've got some stuff written on this somewhere too, which I need to dig out. But there's even how you create a collaborative space and how you lay your space out is framing. How am I going to invite people into this space, which is different to other spaces, and settle them and put them at ease with each other? Allow them to arrive as themselves. Help them on the journey, because each meeting can be a story. Each workshop has its own narrative journey if you're designing it that way. How do I close the space at the end? All of that is framing a space in which you can connect with each other and with the stories that you want to tell and want to have heard. So for me, it's kind of like a design thing as well.
Yeah. I mean, from a simple story introduction perspective, one of the phrases I like to use is just before I get, especially into a clarity story, I'll frame it by saying, look, before we get into this, I just want to provide a little bit of context.
Nice.
And then you sort of go, okay, I'm framing this as, this is the context setter. And then you go, in the past it was like this, then these things happened. And it's quite an easy way for leaders to, frame it so people go, why is he telling us about the past? You know, like, why do I need to know that? And so it sort of helps solidify it for people. One of the other elements, which is, we'll get away from the questions for a moment, and I'll just, because there's one other element I wanted to sort of share with you, just in terms of an outcome you get from these strategy stories beyond communication, and that is a strategy story. When you convey the strategy as a story, you're actually helping it to ring true to the audience, right? And when you have plan on the page and other sort of mechanisms, it often doesn't ring true. You know, you're sort of sitting there and it seems a bit impervious. You're trying to make a connection with it, and it's hard to make that connection. There's a lovely bit of research. It was really a meta paper pulling together a whole bunch of research from cognitive science. It was done in 2016, but they listed a whole range of things that need to be in place for people to feel that it rings true, right? No, and the first one is that it needs to be easy to understand, right? If something's easy to understand, must be true, right? Second one is that it fits in with your own beliefs, right? So if you hear someone say something fits in your own beliefs, you know, because of the essentially the confirmation bias, we go, it must be true. And one of the great things about a story, which is just talking about the events in a company, right? This happened, then that happened, then this happened, you know, and that's why we're doing this. It just sort of gets people going, yeah, that did happen. And I remember that happening. Okay, I can see why we're doing this. And so, you know, that it just, again, helps people to ring true. And the third one I just thought I'd raise is around coherence, right? And again, when you put something in a story structure, you're forcing it to be coherent, right? Unless you're doing some real crazy avant-garde, you know, a version of the story, you know, maybe Quentin Tarantino style, you know, this story is going to be coherent because it's a series of connected cause and effect events, if you like. So I think this is one of the massive benefits that we don't really talk about so much, is the how much the strategy starts to ring true when it's put into the story format.
I think that there's a piece that I would add to that. Everything you say is right. And in terms of reducing resistance or the anti-story or but we tried that 5 years ago and we tried that 3 years ago and it didn't work then, why is it going to work this time? Kind of skepticism. There is that acknowledging the past thing, but there's also, for me, at the end of a clarity story, there's a bit of the how. So one of the things that we're going to do next to make sure that we've learned from the past is do these kinds of things. So there's a bit of and at the end of a clarity story, so what you can expect next and what we expect from you next, you know, the deal is this. And you know, not all of it's going to be great. There are going to be stumbling blocks. We might get stuck like we did in, you know, 1993, that some of you still remember. But this is a chance for us to learn from that and bring that forward and do it differently this time. So let's use those. So there's a piece of an invitation at the end to get stuck in, to create momentum out of the end of the clarity story and back into everyday life. And what does this mean for me? That's really important as a sort of segue, call to action thing.
Yeah, right. And you know, and if you can layer on top of that a leader who's willing to show vulnerability, you know, as they're telling the story, to sort of go, you know what, that thing that happened in '96, I was actually a big cause of that.
Exactly. Right? Yeah, you know, absolutely.
At the time, it seemed like the right thing to do, but you know, looking back at it now, it was really a problem. And I have to say that was a big part of that was my doing. And just by doing that, you're now inviting people into your story and into connecting into that strategy at another level.
I use the word invitation a lot. Is the story an invitation? Is the story an invitation? Is, to me, is a very fundamental checking. As if it's closed and shrink wrapped, it's not an invitation, is it? It's an instruction or a direction.
Yeah.
So for me, the test is always, how are you opening it out to be an invitation all the way through, and particularly at the end of whenever you're doing your thing.
Yeah, that's true. So, I might ask Sinden just to pop in the URL. I wrote an article just recently, last couple of weeks. It was published in Management Today on that vulnerability piece. You know, because I was very taken by Brené Brown's Netflix special that she did. She did a Netflix special on vulnerability and shame, where there's another element of it. And I think there's some great insights in that, not particularly my article, but in her Netflix presentation. So have a look at that. You might get some other ideas. Now, it'd be good to go through a couple more of our questions. What have you got?
Can I do the opposite? Can I do the opposite of upvoting here? Because Paramjit has come up with a really nice
you're going to the bottom
question.
of the
I'm going to the bottom of the list because I like outliers, right? Sorry.
You do.
Well, let me just check. So, understanding the cognitive description. So, how do you create resonance at the emotional level? What are the tactics for creating resonance in stories is one. And I guess, Karen, below that is almost the same question. So I'm merging them to get some upvoting, right? How can you tell when a story rings true? So there are some things in your experience that are good resonance or ringing true tests.
Well, I think those things that I mentioned, you know, if you had big events that everyone experienced, right? If they're in the story, it rings true. It's. I'm just reading Param's. Interested in the cognitive descriptions. Oh, okay. Okay, so yeah, just go to that paper that I wrote on the strategy story. I think Sindon put it in the chat window. You'll see all the references in there, and you'll be able to go straight to that paper. Yeah, it could be good information for you. Terrific.
I want to say one other thing, which is to Manish, and this is not, I have had this translation issue actually a lot because I've done a lot of work with the United Nations system, and there's more to be said about that than we can say right now, but it might be something I can bring up when I talk about interview techniques and so on next time, because it's been a lot of multilingual translating, interpret, you know, a lot of that work. And it's a really great question also whether people can tell stories, how well people tell stories not in their first language, in their second or their third or their fourth language. And how that kind of thing is a very interesting thing. But I do want to I'd like to offer you this, which is that a friend of mine had to do the best man speech at her brother's wedding in the Czech Republic recently. And half the audience, very few of the audience spoke both Czech and English. So I sent her to the escapologist down the road, who's also a mime artist, who you met, Shawn. And he gave her some instruction and some white mime gloves, and she mimed the whole of her best man speech after saying a couple of sentences of Czech that would say to everyone, look, I don't speak any Czech, so the rest of this speech is going to be like, and then she put her gloves on and she mimed it. And apparently it was the first time her brother has ever been speechless. But she really had to find a really simple story to tell, you know, with her and her brother growing up, and then her brother and his wife having 2 babies. But so thinking and Chris Hyman, who I work with, who couldn't be here today, has come to some of the others, does a lot of work on inhabiting stories. What happens if you take the speaking away and you have to act a story out? How do you find the through line in the story then? And that can be quite revealing as a way of developing your stories as well.
One of the other things, what Manish is talking about is, I'm not too sure if I understand it 100%, and maybe we're talking at cross purposes, but he's saying here that he's not sure that the audience wants to hear about the choices, right? Now, a strategy is made up of choices, right? People they're making choices. Well, a good strategy has choices. So, in other words, the leadership has said, we're doing this, but we're not doing that, right? We've chosen to do this rather than that. And that actually makes for a great story, because as soon as those choices have been made, people ask the question, so why? Why are we doing that and not this? Oh, well, let me tell you, in the past it was like this, then these things happen. That's why we're making this choice. And everyone goes,
nice.
Oh, of course, that's why we're doing that choice. Whereas, unfortunately, a lot of strategies are not choices. They'll say things like, our strategy has got 3 elements to it, and our first one is people. And you go, oh, okay, so what's the choice there? So on the one hand, you're not going to have people, and this time you are having people. Yeah. And so there are these ridiculous elements. And I see it particularly in the public sector, I have to say. But organisations, I don't think the level of capability around strategy development is that high. I think leaders get to a point without having to do too much or even not much thinking about strategy. They're getting things done and they're sort of having an emergent strategy, but I don't know, I'm a bit skeptical about that side of things. Now I'm keeping an eye on the time here. We got 5 minutes to finish up, and so it probably gives us.
Gosh, there's so many good questions. Listen, Paul Sedgwick, how do individuals iterate their own versions? How are they supported? How's that consistent? Brilliant question, Paul. Interviewing technique we're going to come to next time. The choices question I think you've partly answered, I think, with Manish, but also building dilemmas in is good storytelling too. Dilemmas are good storytelling, right?
Yeah, indeed.
Once these complex emotions are revealed, how do you work with these in the collective? Also a great question, Nikki. How do you manage, if you make room for emotions, you're unleashing quite a complex, and it needs a different kind of leadership. I mean, the emotional intelligence of the leaders has to go up, or at least their ability to look as though they're emotionally intelligent has to go right up. So I think that's also...
Yeah. Well, let me tackle some of Paul Sedgwick's question at the top there, Victoria, because, I mean, it is, all it's kind of like the detailed stuff of actually how to run a strategy story engagement, I suppose. So a couple of things. The iteration one is a really important one. So we did a sort of a strategy story for a big utilities company, and it was just the IT group we did the strategy story for, and the IT group had 1,000 people in it, right? It's one of these massive organisations, and so we did the strategy story for the overarching IT group, but then each ones of the subsections had to retell their story. Like the architects had to go off and come up their own version of the strategy story, and the infrastructure guys and the software developer guys and the operations guys, each one had to go away using the same structure, knowing they had a spine that they had to, sort of link back to, and be, they were adding the flesh to this sort of skeleton that they'd been given. And tell a story that made sense. So the events were different, right? Not entirely different, but often different. So the architecture guys might have talked about, we had to bring in the new ISO standard of X, Y, Z, and this really changed the way we thought about why. Whereas at the top level, they wouldn't even mention ISO standards. They would have talked about business, sort of pressures and how they interacted with the business part of the organisation, etc. So that's certainly an important element of it. And then the next level down, when they're iterating it, owns it in a different way, right? And they own that element of it. But, the consistency is an important part. We talk about there is we like to think that there is an original score. This one's a nice one for you, Victoria. There's an original score, but everyone has their own arrangements. Right.
Very nice. I can get that with all the music stuff.
You should be able to hear the main themes out of that original score in the jazz arrangement, in the, sort of pop arrangement or whatever it might be.
There's another thing too, which is consistency. So actually I was talking as part of a big narrative for a change. That's what we call our thing of negotiating the equivalent of a clarity story with a few kind of adjustments, but it overlaps with yours. We were doing this for different parts of a very big organization shifting its culture. In fact, and one of the people we did it was procurement.
Yeah.
And so we got their narrative for a change. So essentially, what is their clarity story about this bigger shift for us in procurement? Right. But what they did, they got this at the leadership level, and they kind of really found out what the core of what you would call a clarity story is. And then the campaign part we devised with them, we ended up calling 100 conversations. This is going back 3 or 4 years. So they, let's have conversations. If there are about 1,000 people in procurement, let's aim to have 100 conversations, which is essentially everybody gets a chance. 1,000 people in procurement get a chance to think about this story and put their thoughts about it. And, in a semi-formal way, and every leader, they're hosted. and the host is interested in what those people say and in carrying it back up to the story. So they're very interested in hosting the local conversation. And the key was there, over 2 years, they ran this ritual 3 or 4 times until the next strategy took over. So it wasn't a one-off. And it became the 100 conversations. For 1,000 people to have 100 conversations. So this ritual of 100 conversations became part, until that was overtaken by something else in the organization, of the chance for us to all sit down. And the bold thing for them was to have this coordination of local conversations that would come back up, because it was all leaders who would then turn up at the leadership team, the executive leadership team meetings, and be carrying those conversations back in to connect them with the top line strategy. So that kind of, I think that's a very nice example of connection. And where are we?
Now, I'm mindful of the time. We've just gone. We've just hit our end of our time. So
never enough time.
Thanks everyone for coming along and indulging Victoria and I in our conversations, where we get to catch up with each other and chat and learn from each other's story experiences. And we're going to have our last one, I think, probably in October, right?
I think
that's
so.
what we're aiming for. And please, get the word out, let people know to come along. We just want to have as many people as we can thinking, doing, making a difference with stories in organisations around the world. So if you can get people along and participate, that'd be terrific. And we're hoping to pull a lot of this information together at the end, so we can sort of provide that back to everyone. And
may I say one other thing?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, we don't want to lose these questions. They're really great. So let's use those to sort of steer, as well as my idea about talking about some interview techniques. Let's use these questions to steer our content next time, so that we've properly taken account of some very nice and challenging questions. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is, we only ever intended to do 4 of these. At some stage, if you think that some next year is another series 2. If you think series 2 is going to be fruitful, we've got big back catalogues, and I'm sure we could rustle up some new stuff. But or we can leave it here. This is just kind of play, really, isn't it? What a treat.
Good.
What a treat to play in good company.
Well, everyone have a lovely rest of your day, evening, wherever you might be in the world. And we look forward to catching up with you again in another episode of Conversations Around Story. Bye for now.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
Bye.